So, what are the Russians and Ukrainians up to again? Ladies and gentlemen, the war continues. Kyiv and Dnipro have been bombed, and the Russians are continuing their extensive bombing campaigns after taking a few days' break and stockpiling a bunch of drones and a bunch of missiles. We'll take a closer look at it, because of course they attacked civilian targets and infrastructure, mainly water infrastructure at this moment. But on the other hand, the Ukrainians attacked gas and oil infrastructure, and these were not just symbolic attacks, they caused quite significant damage. So we'll take a look at that. And of course, we'll also look at the front itself, which at this moment is experiencing quite an interesting development. So if you want to know what kind of interesting developments the Ukrainian front is actually experiencing, keep watching. But we'll start with the Russian attack. In the last 3 days, the Russians have, of course, attacked 3 times. In the first 2 days of the observed period, they sent around 200 to just over 200 drones, but altogether it was 1,100 to 1,150 drones and 70 to 73 missiles. What is positive is that the Ukrainian air defense managed to shoot down, out of this huge number of drones and missiles that have arrived in the last 3 days, 1,042 drones and 40 missiles. They managed to either shoot them down or disrupt them electronically, and at that point they didn't hit what they were supposed to hit. That means the success rate of defense against drones is 90% over the last 3 days, and the defense against missiles is 55%. That's highly effective and very good air defense. So in this regard, Ukrainians, yes, they're getting more and more skilled. And as for drones, even though of course a lot of them get through simply because there are so many, the shooting down of those drones is really getting better and better. Really, reaching 90 is already a masterpiece. That's something even Israel couldn't always do when they fought against Hamas and Hezbollah back in the early days, even when they had full coverage. Even with armed air defense, they weren't that successful back then. They didn't have a 90% success rate. Well, against those missiles, it's obviously a bit worse in Ukraine, but still, the whole situation is improving. By the way, at this point, the Ukrainians even have electronic warfare that can affect even the more intelligent Russian missiles. For example, it can manipulate the Kinjal, and in that case, the Kinjal doesn't necessarily have to be shot down, but electronic warfare can deflect it from its course. So this is another thing the Ukrainians have started using, and it improves their effectiveness. Anyway, overall, the Russians hit a bunch of cities, mainly focusing on Kyiv and Odessa, and even though it says here on IP that they killed 11 people, unfortunately that's outdated information, and the number of dead was over 13, maybe at this point it's already 15 because of course the casualty numbers keep rising. So yes, the Russians mainly attacked cities, and besides physical damage and deaths, they also caused long-term and massive power outages and water outages. And it's clear that Russia continues pursuing its goal of terror bombing, that is, terrorizing the civilian population. Evidence of terror bombing can be, for example, the fact that several rescuers were killed and several were injured. They arrived at the places where the first salvo hit, and after they arrived and started rescuing people, more bombs came, and these bombs were aimed at the same place with the intention of injuring the rescuers. So that's a clear signature of terror bombing, with the main goal of attacking the morale of the population. And then you might ask, how is it possible, if the Russians are targeting civilians and firing so much at civilian cities, that the number of casualties is relatively low? Sure, 13 or 14 people dead and 100 injured is not a small number objectively, but at the same time, it's actually relatively few considering how many missiles and drones were launched. So the first reason is that Ukrainians have a very sophisticated warning system, and they know when a major attack is coming. Of course, when there are regular attacks, just a few hundred drones and 2 missiles, most Ukrainians don't hide and just kind of shrug it off and think, hey, Hopefully it won't affect me. Hopefully it won't be me. In this sense, hopefully it won't be me. But when a big attack is about to happen, a really big attack, there are certain clues that give the Ukrainian side the ability to know that a major attack is probably coming. And when people know that a huge attack is coming, they go to the shelters much more often and they try much harder not to be in places where something could happen to them. So based on that, of course, they aren't killed as often because they hide much more frequently. And besides that, as we said, Ukraine's air defense is extremely successful. Therefore, for that reason as well, there aren't as many dead and wounded as there would be if they weren't in shelters and if the air defense simply wasn't successful. So that's all I wanted to say about that. And of course, we know what Russia is trying to achieve with this terror bombing, with the destruction of Ukrainian cities, and with attacks on Ukrainian civilians. They are obviously trying to scare the civilians, trying to demoralize the population, and as a result of these demoralizing actions, of course, radicalization deepens, and there are much more frequent calls for revenge and so on, which in itself also causes certain negative reactions, negative responses. For example, in Poland, when really strong emotions come to the surface and Bandera starts being revived. So at that moment, the terror bombing has both an intimidating and a radicalizing effect, which can be problematic. Besides that, of course, it also exhausts the air defense, which could lead to it being less successful in the future. But for now, they are doing quite well. And the destruction of infrastructure itself is quite effective in really pissing people off. Samozřejmě, of course, fortunately, thanks to the fact that the Ukrainians keep very good records and make sure everyone knows how many missiles the Russians have fired, because they monitor it for the reason that every missile and every drone is one of the crimes they want to present as evidence later. We know quite well how many drones and missiles have attacked Ukraine because they have absolutely no reason to hide it. When it comes to the opposite number, meaning how many drones have attacked Russia, that's a bit harder to determine, because we have some reports here that a key node of the Russian pipeline was hit by massive fire from Ukrainian drones. That's clear. But from the Russian side, we only know that 31. On May 31st, they managed to shoot down 216 drones. On June 1st, they managed to shoot down about 100 drones. And on the 2nd of June, they managed to shoot down about 148 drones. That means that in the last 3 days, the Russians report 436 drones shot down. That absolutely doesn't mean that the Ukrainians only sent 436 drones. It means they probably sent a lot more, because we know there were some successful strikes. So either they sent more and the Russians are only reporting what they shot down, or they sent exactly that many, but the Russians are lying about being able to shoot down those drones. By the way, the Russians have already started using drones that shoot down other drones. They've already managed to copy the Ukrainian model of anti-drone drones. And we can assume that if the Russians are able to scale this up and get this drone shooting system into their air defenses near their refineries, then it's going to get a bit more complicated for the Ukrainians in their efforts to destroy the Russian oil industry, because the Russians are starting to catch up in their ability to defend against drones. So only the Ukrainians have gained the ability to attack using drones in significant numbers and effectively destroy the Russian oil infrastructure. Now, the Russians are coming in to disrupt this by developing their own counter-weapon, probably in cooperation with China, right? So that's a bit of a problem for the Ukrainians. Now, what did Ukraine hit? We have a few reports here, namely that Ukrainian drones hit an oil refinery in Saratov, Russia, and there's a fuel shortage in Crimea. Sure, there's a fuel shortage in Crimea. That's kind of an evergreen topic. However, the Saratov refinery was hit, which is a refinery that processes 7 million tons of oil per year. They make gasoline, diesel, and other fuels there. And it is very relevant, especially for the civilian economy, but also for military logistics. The civilian economy, which is already dying in Russia, is likely to see a decline in GDP. And a decline in GDP while you have a war economy and brutal government spending. That's not a good thing. That's worse than bad. However, the Saratov refinery is a very important, very key enterprise. It was hit. It's on fire. Another successful attack was the one on the Lazarevo liner production and dispatch station. In other words, the linear production dispatch station. It's basically a kind of hub, you could say. And it's part of the oil pipeline system. So probably some pipes or pumping stations were hit. Simply put, another oil industry facility in the Kyiv region was hit, and this is the result. This isn't some kind of explosion or anything like that where a huge column of debris would rise. No, no, no. This is beautiful, thick, absolutely impenetrable smoke. If you started packing this into boxes, you could export it somewhere that doesn't have smoke, because this is such magnificent smoke, such a magnificent column of smoke without any wind at all. The lack of wind makes it a completely surreal experience, you could say. So this is Lazarevo in the Kyiv region. Then here we have more footage from other strikes. Here we have the Rostov region. So the Rostov region was also hit. Apparently a fuel depot was struck there. And then here we have a few videos, a few examples, a few pieces of evidence. We can see smoke rising again some shooting. Here we have the geolocation. Here we can see the air defense trying to fire. So the refineries were hit, but what also took quite a solid hit was Fronta, because Fronta was hit in such a way that the Ukrainians allegedly managed to gain more territory than the Russians were able to capture. In other words, the ratio of gain to lost territory is currently in favor of Ukraine. We know, of course, that the greatest intensity of fighting is still around Pokrovsk. Yes, we know that. And where is Pokrovsk located? Once it's out of that pocket, it's hard to find. Here in Pokrovsk, still, or around Pokrovsk, beyond Pokrovsk, the biggest battles are happening exactly in this direction. There are hundreds of combat encounters, thousands of drones, hundreds of big bombs falling and so on. So the fighting here is really very intense. But even though the fighting is very intense, the results are truly dismal. In the past month, the Russians have reportedly managed to occupy only about 14 square kilometers. But according to the information we are receiving, this is inaccurate, because the Ukrainians managed to retake a little more than 14 square kilometers. But of course, the question is whether all this talk about who occupied which territory isn't just a load of nonsense. Because we know that right now there are very wide no man's land areas, gray zones, areas where you can't say who controls them. And at the moment when the Russians send one soldier there and claim they've taken it, and then the Ukrainians send 2 drones, kill that soldier, and say they've liberated it, of course they count it as captured territory and liberated territory, but in reality you can't really say whether they actually held it or not, how it's counted, or what anyone really means. And of course, when it comes to who has captured how much territory, that's mostly estimated by OSINTs, various civilian analysts and so on, who watch different videos, look at different photos, and do various geolocations. And based on that, they try to figure out where everyone probably is and who controls which territory. But at this moment, it's practically impossible to evaluate that accurately, so it's really hard to say whether the Russians actually captured less territory than the Ukrainians took back from them, because you can never really say whether the Russians considered it captured or not. Look, but in the end, that's kind of a pointless debate. Whether the Ukrainians liberated more territory than they lost, if we're talking about a few hundred meters here and there that they gained while the Russians took just a little less from them, it really doesn't matter. What's important is that it's very close. It's very close, and based on that, we can say that the front is more or less stable, that it's stuck, even though the fighting is still intense. Right now, a Russian offensive is underway. At this moment, beautiful green vegetation is already part of the battlefield, which the Russians were waiting for. They said that once spring comes and the leaves grow, it will be possible to hide from drones, and based on that, they will advance. Leaves are everywhere, it's beautiful, nothing can be seen, the grass is tall, and so on. Russia is advancing painfully slowly. Yeah? Of course, around Kosti it's closing up somehow, in some way. Near Pokrovsk there are some advances here, but it's paid for with a huge number of casualties and a huge number of attacks and costs. The advance is really very, very small, and the offensive is basically stuck. It's basically shattered. It's basically shattered, and at this point the Russians will need some new approach, some new technological advantage, more soldiers, mobilization, or just give up on it. Because right now the progress is really minimal, and that's even though the attacks are massive, frequent, expensive, and bloody. So that's how it is. That's the current situation in Ukraine and on the battlefield. Please write in the comments what you think. And I would also add a few things like the fact that there's still a big problem in Ukraine with mobilization commissioners behaving like pigs. Often. And even though Ukraine said it would address it, according to the ombudsman, the solution is insufficient. So here we probably agree with Russian propaganda that sometimes those recruiters really behave terribly towards people who don't report after getting a draft notice, meaning they're breaking the law, which of course people who break the law shouldn't be treated nicely. But at the same time, we don't need to be violent or extremely rude towards them either. Simply put, let's win them over, let's escort them away somehow, and that's it, done. The problem is that from time to time, there are incidents that could be considered very violent or sometimes even mentally and physically torturous. Those incidents aren't very frequent, like there are thousands of mobilization events every year, but still, those incidents do happen. And according to the ombudsman, Ukraine hasn't done enough yet to prevent those incidents, or to make sure that if they do happen, they are punished. This is important to mention. In my opinion, it's really good to put pressure on this because when those mobilization commissioners behave badly, it's just perfect ammunition. Exactly for propaganda, demoralization, and so on. From time to time, we see videos where a lot of people are shouting at those mobilization commissioners, and it's more or less a good thing because, first of all, we know that there is a certain freedom in Ukraine that people can express themselves like this against their actions. At the same time, we know here that the Ukrainian state is aware of it, or at least the Ukrainian state knows about it and doesn't try to hide the fact that it's happening. And at the same time, we know that those protests against the drafts are not really massive. It's really just maybe dozens, at most a low 100 people, when something really, really terrible is happening right there on the street or in that area. But at the same time, you know that there are thousands of these drafts and mobilizer actions every year, and there are dozens of videos on the internet. That means there are actually very few of these incidents. But hey, dozens of videos already create the illusion that there are a ton of them, right? Which, in a world where everyone has a cell phone and anyone can record when something bad happens, and at the same time we know that the Ukrainian side is encouraging people to record when, according to them, something bad is happening. It's just normal that you'll have these things recorded and you'll feel like it's happening everywhere and all the time, which it isn't. No. And that's probably all. That's probably all for the Russian economy. We'll discuss it another time. For now, have a great time. Let me know what you think about the whole situation, how you evaluate it. And if you're interested in the issue between the Navrotsky and Zelenetsky UPA and the Poles, the Banderites, and the Volyn affair, then check out the next video today. You can also support me with your like and comment or through the QR code. And if none of that, then you can try another video that the algorithm recommends to you here. The algorithm is smart. The algorithm is great. God bless the algorithm. Support it. Have fun. We'll continue. Join the streams.